The crisp autumn leaves crunched beneath Jonathan Pierce's polished Italian leather shoes as he strode through Evergreen Cemetery. At 42, Jonathan embodied success, tall, commanding, with salt and pepper hair that only accentuated his distinguished features. As the CEO of Pierce Global, a financial empire worth billions, he commanded respect in boardrooms spanning 3 continents. Today, however, there was no briefcase in hand, no power tie draped across his shoulders, and the sharp glint in his steel-gray eyes had softened into something more vulnerable. It was the 10th anniversary of his mother's passing. Eleanor Pierce had been his anchor, the one person who looked beyond his wealth and ambition to see the boy who still needed guidance. Her absence left a void that neither an expanding business empire nor a lavish Manhattan penthouse could ever fill. Each year, on this day, Jonathan dismissed his driver and security detail, opting to walk the familiar path to her grave alone. 10 years, Mom, he murmured as the elegant marble headstone came into view. The monument, like Eleanor herself, stood apart, understated yet undeniably refined. He placed a bouquet of white lilies at its base, her favorite. That's when he noticed her. A small figure sat huddled on the other side of his mother's grave, a girl no older than 7, with tangled auburn hair and a faded blue dress that had seen better days. In her hands, she cradled a single wildflower, setting it beside his carefully arranged bouquet. "Hello," Jonathan said, taken aback by the unexpected presence in what had always been a private moment. The child looked up, and Jonathan was struck by her eyes, deep brown, filled with wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. Her clothes were thin, her worn canvas shoes scuffed beyond repair, and a small backpack, once pink, had faded to a dusty rose. "You're her son," the girl stated, not as a question, but as a certainty. Jonathan frowned, caught off guard. "Yes, I am. Did you know my mother?" The child's face remained solemn. "She visits me in my dreams and tells me stories," she said. "She told me you'd come today, and that I should wait for you." A chill crept up Jonathan's spine despite the mild October air. He prided himself on logic and reason, the very traits that had built his empire. Yet something in the girl's unwavering tone made his practiced rationality falter. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Lena," she replied. Jonathan's gaze flickered toward the bouquet of lilies he had placed moments before. "A coincidence?" "And where are your parents, Lena?" he asked gently. A shadow crossed the child's delicate face. "My mom went to heaven," she whispered. "Last year, Dad tried, but—" Lena's voice trailed off, her small shoulders lifting in a shrug that seemed far too mature for her frame. Jonathan's security instincts kicked in as he scanned the cemetery, searching for any sign of who might have brought the child here. The grounds were nearly empty, except for an elderly gardener working some distance away. "Did you come here alone?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. Lena nodded. "We live in the apartments across from the cemetery entrance. Dad works 3 jobs. Today, he's at the factory until late. I come here sometimes to talk to the angels." Jonathan's mind raced. A child this young, alone in a cemetery, speaking of dream visits from his deceased mother. It defied all logic, yet something held him there, preventing him from dismissing it as a strange coincidence, or worse, an elaborate deception. "What stories does my mother tell you in these dreams?" he asked cautiously. Lena brightened, settling more comfortably on the grass. She talks about you when you were little, how you used to build towers with blocks and get so mad when they felt that you refused to try again. She said that changed when you were 6, when you finally built one taller than your head. The girl smiled. She says you never stopped building after that. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. It was true, a memory so distant he had almost forgotten it himself. His mother had often referred to that moment as the day his determination was born, but it wasn't something he had ever shared. Not in interviews, not in his carefully curated public biography. She also said you're lonely in your tower now, Lena continued, unaware of Jonathan's stunned silence, that you build and build, but forgot why you started in the first place. The cemetery seemed to still, as if the world itself was listening. Slowly, Jonathan lowered himself to the ground across from Lena, no longer concerned about his tailored suit brushing against the grass. "What else did she say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That I should give you this." Lena reached into her worn backpack and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. "I found it buried in the flower bed near the angel statue last month," she said softly. "Your mom said it was meant for you." Jonathan's hand trembled as he took the locket. He knew it instantly. It had belonged to his mother, a family heirloom containing a tiny photograph of her parents. She had been wearing it the day she died, but when her personal effects had been returned to him, the locket had been missing. It had vanished at the hospital. The hospital staff had searched for it, but eventually concluded it must have been lost during the emergency procedures. "This is impossible," Jonathan whispered, turning the locket over in his palm. The distinctive Pierce family crest was engraved on the back. "She said you'd say that," Lena replied with a gentle smile. "She also told me to remind you, remember the promise under the willow tree." Jonathan felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. On her deathbed, his mother had squeezed his hand and whispered those exact words. He had assumed it was just a medication, the fevered murmurings of a woman slipping away. No one else had been in the room. No one else could possibly know. The logical part of his mind raced for explanations. Had the girl overheard something? Had someone put her up to this? Perhaps it was even an elaborate ploy by a competitor, meant to unsettle him. But as he studied Lena's innocent, unwavering gaze, he found no trace of deception. "Why would my mother speak to you?" he asked, his voice tight with restraint. Lena's answer was simple. She said we're both missing pieces. And sometimes the universe puts broken things together to make them whole again. Behind them, the autumn breeze stirred, rustling the fallen leaves. A single white lily petal drifted from his bouquet, floating through the crisp air before landing gently in Lena's lap. She picked it up with delicate fingers, studying it for a moment before extending it toward Jonathan. "Your mom says it's time for you to remember how to live, not just succeed," she said, her voice carrying an authority far beyond her years. "And that starts with keeping promises, even the ones you try to forget." Jonathan stared at the child before him, his carefully ordered world tilting on its axis. Who was this girl? How could she possibly know things so personal, so private? And what would happen if, against all reason, he allowed himself to believe that, somehow, his mother had found a way to reach him through this unlikely messenger? As the questions swirled in his mind, one truth became undeniable. This annual visit to Eleanor Pierce's grave had just become the first chapter of a story he never anticipated. Jonathan couldn't simply walk away. After their encounter at the cemetery, he insisted on escorting Lena home. What he found only deepened his unease. Her apartment building stood in stark contrast to the world he knew. Peeling paint, a security door with a broken lock, dimly lit hallways thick with the scent of mildew, and inside, in the small, cluttered space she called home, his unease only grew. The apartment, though modest, was meticulously clean. Every piece of worn furniture had been carefully arranged to make the most of the small space. Crayon drawings brightened the walls, colorful landscapes, and figures that revealed both talent and imagination. "Dad won't be home until 10, Lena explained, setting her backpack on a small table. "But I'm used to being by myself. I can make macaroni and cheese." Jonathan's chest tightened. At 7 years old, he had been surrounded by a team of household staff while his parents managed their growing business. The thought of this child preparing her own meals and spending hours alone sent a wave of concern through him. "I should wait for your father," he said, trying to keep his tone casual while his mind raced with questions. "We need to talk." Lena shrugged. "Okay, you can look at my books if you want. I go to the library every Saturday." As Lena settled into her after-school routine, Jonathan took in the surroundings, searching for clues about her life. Framed photos lined a narrow shelf, revealing a younger, happier version of Lena alongside a woman with the same auburn hair. Her mother, he assumed. In more recent pictures, a tired-looking man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands stood beside her. The sequence of images told a quiet story, a joyful family, then hospital visits, then just the two of them. In each picture, Lena's smile seemed to fade a little more. On a small desk in the corner, Jonathan found school papers marked with gold stars and encouraging notes from teachers. Despite everything, Lena was excelling academically. Above the desk, a shelf held well-worn copies of classic children's novels, clearly treasured and often read. "Your mother," Jonathan said carefully as Lena arranged her homework. "What happened to her?" "Cancer," she answered without looking up. "The doctors tried really hard, but Mom said sometimes even angels can't fix everything." She paused, her small hand hovering over a math worksheet. That's when the bills started coming. "Dad keeps them in a box under his bed. Sometimes I hear him crying at night when he thinks I'm asleep." Jonathan's mind immediately went into calculation mode. Medical debt was one of the most devastating financial burdens for middle-class families. If Lena's mother had worked, the loss of her income would have made their situation even worse. "Lena," he said, sitting beside her at the table, "that promise you mentioned, the one under the willow tree, what was it?" She looked up at him, her brown eyes serious. "I don't know what it means," she admitted. "I just know your mom was really sad that you forgot it." Jonathan closed his eyes, letting a memory surface, one he had long buried. Jonathan had deliberately buried a memory beneath layers of ambition and achievement. The willow tree had once stood on the grounds of their family's first home, before success had propelled him into increasingly exclusive neighborhoods. On his 10th birthday, after he had expressed his first real interest in finance, his mother had taken him to sit beneath its sweeping branches. "Money is just a tool, Jonathan," she had said, her voice gentle but firm. "Remember that wealth without purpose is like a ship without a compass. Impressive, but lost. Promise me that whatever you build in this life, you'll use it to make the world a little better, not just a little richer." He had promised, earnestly and easily, as children do. But somewhere along the relentless climb to the top, that idealistic pledge had become inconvenient. Pierce Global was known for its ruthless efficiency, not its compassion. Jonathan had rationalized that job creation was contribution enough. Personal involvement in philanthropy was something he would address someday when he had more time. The memory left him feeling exposed and oddly ashamed, especially in front of this child, who somehow seemed to see right through him. The silence was broken by the sound of a key turning in the lock. Lena's father, Daniel Hayes, stopped short in the doorway. Exhaustion lined his face, but his expression quickly shifted to alarm at the sight of a stranger in his home. Jonathan recognized the instinctive tension that straightened the man's tired shoulders, the quiet, protective stance of a father. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, moving quickly to Lena's side. "Dad, this is Mr. Pierce," Lena said calmly. "He's the son of the lady I told you about from my dreams." Daniel's expression flickered from confusion to recognition. "Pierce? As in Pierce Global?" His eyes narrowed. "Look, whatever this is about, my daughter has an active imagination. I don't want any trouble." Jonathan stood, extending his hand. "Jonathan Pierce. And there's no trouble, Mr. Hayes. I met Lena at my mother's grave today, and she knew things she couldn't possibly know. Daniel sank into a chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "She's been talking about your mother for months," he admitted. "I thought they were just stories, something she made up to cope after we lost Sarah." His gaze drifted to Lena, a mixture of concern and wonder in his tired eyes. "The doctor said children sometimes create elaborate fantasies to process grief." Jonathan hesitated, then asked, "What exactly did she tell you?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "Details about a woman named Eleanor, how she played piano and loved gardening, how she made her son practice his presentation speeches in front of her roses because he let out a quiet, disbelieving chuckle. Because if you can convince a flower to listen, you can convince anyone." Jonathan stiffened, because that was something his mother had actually said, and there was no way Lena could have known. "She could have read about your family somewhere," Daniel said, his tone carefully measured, "or overheard something at school. Your name carries weight." Jonathan felt a chill. His mother's rose garden had been his first audience. First for school presentations, then later for business pitches. But that wasn't something recorded in business profiles or society pages. "There's more," Jonathan said quietly, reaching into his pocket. He produced a silver locket. "Lena found this. My mother's missing locket. It disappeared the day she died, 10 years ago." Daniel stared at the locket, then at his daughter, who remained unfazed, calmly working through her multiplication tables. I don't understand," he murmured. "Neither do I," Jonathan admitted. But for the first time, he was beginning to think that perhaps understanding wasn't necessary. Only acceptance. He took a breath. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like to help you and Lena." The words surprised Jonathan as much as they seemed to surprise Daniel. Daniel's expression immediately hardened. "We're not looking for charity." "It's not charity," Jonathan replied, the certainty in his voice unshakable. "It's fulfilling a promise I made a long time ago." Later that evening, after arranging to meet Daniel again to discuss possibilities that would respect his pride while securing Lena's future, Jonathan sat alone in his penthouse. The city stretched out beneath him like a sea of scattered stars, beautiful but distant. His phone buzzed with business matters he had neglected throughout the day, but for once, they all seemed trivial. Turning the locket over in his hand, he traced its familiar edges before finally working up the courage to open it. Inside, alongside the tiny photograph of his grandparents, was something he had never seen before, a small piece of paper, folded tightly to fit within the limited space. He carefully unfolded it. In his mother's distinctive handwriting, it read, "The measure of success is not what you gain, but what you give. It's time to come home, Jonathan." The note was dated just days before her death. Yet the locket had supposedly been lost, buried for years before Lena found it. It was impossible. It defied logic. And yet, here it was, tangible evidence of something beyond his understanding. Jonathan thought of the little girl with worn shoes and a bright mind, living in the shadow of loss, yet still finding reasons to leave wildflowers on a stranger's grave. He thought of her father, working 3 jobs to keep them afloat, while a box of unpaid medical bills collected dust beneath his bed. And for the first time in a decade, Jonathan Pierce, billionaire CEO of a global empire, allowed himself to cry for his mother, for a forgotten promise, for the strange, undeniable feeling that his carefully constructed life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, Jonathan cleared his schedule. Meetings were canceled. Calls went unanswered. Instead, he drove to his mother's estate in Connecticut, a sprawling property he still owned but rarely visited. The caretakers kept everything in pristine condition, yet the house felt more like a museum than a home. Walking through its grand halls, Jonathan retraced the steps of his childhood, memories stirring with each familiar room. Eventually, he found himself standing at the threshold of his mother's study. Eleanor Pierce's presence still lingered here, in the carefully arranged bookshelves, in the antique desk where she had written countless letters, in the faint scent of lavender that, somehow, still clung to the air after all these years. Jonathan ran his fingers along the spines of her favorite books, searching, though for what, he wasn't entirely sure. His phone rang. Victoria Langley, his chief operating officer. the woman who effectively ran Pierce Global whenever he was too consumed with his next major acquisition. "I hope you have a very good reason for disappearing," she said, skipping any pleasantries. "The Nakamura deal is hanging by a thread, and the board is getting nervous." "I need you to handle it," Jonathan replied, absently opening one of the desk drawers, "and reschedule the Tokyo trip." There was a pause. Then, "Jonathan, we've been working on this merger for months. It's the largest expansion in company history. What could possibly be more important?" He hesitated. How could he explain? Victoria was brilliant when it came to business, but she had little patience for sentimentality. "Do you remember my mother's foundation?" he asked finally. A beat of silence. Then, "The Eleanor Pierce Children's Fund?" she said cautiously. "It was folded into our corporate giving program 5 years ago. More efficient that way. I want it reinstated," Jonathan said, "as a separate entity, with its original mission." Silence. Then, "Jonathan, what happened at the cemetery yesterday?" "I'm not sure how to explain it," he admitted, closing the last drawer without finding whatever it was he was searching for. "But I need you to trust me on this." "You know I do," Victoria sighed. "I'll start the paperwork. But the board will want answers. They'll get them when I have them myself." As he ended the call, Jonathan's attention was drawn to something on the bookshelf, a small wooden box. He had never noticed it before. Or perhaps he had seen it 1,000 times but never truly looked. He took it down. It was locked, but beneath it, affixed to the bottom, hung a tiny key on a delicate chain. Carefully, Jonathan unlocked the box. Inside, he found a collection of letters. Inside the small wooden box, Jonathan found letters, newspaper clippings, and photographs. The letters were addressed to the children of Street Clares, spanning the last decade of his mother's life. St. Clare's. The name nudged at his memory. It had been one of his mother's many charitable efforts, a small orphanage and community center in a struggling neighborhood. The same neighborhood, he suddenly realized, where Lena and her father now lived. Among the papers, Jonathan found a photograph that made his blood run cold. His mother, kneeling beside a group of children at what appeared to be a holiday party. And standing next to her, a woman who looked strikingly like an older version of Lena. Same auburn hair. Same warm, gentle smile. He flipped the photograph over. "Eleanor and Sarah, our newest volunteer with the children. Christmas 2013. Sarah, Lena's mother." Jonathan's mind raced. Could it be that Sarah had worked alongside his mother? That at some point, Lena had actually met Eleanor Pierce? But that still didn't explain how the girl knew private family moments, or the locket, or the promise. Before he could fully process it, he found himself driving back into the city, the box of his mother's papers resting on the passenger seat. But instead of heading to his penthouse, he followed a different path, straight to the address he had found in his mother's records. St. Clare's Community Center was a modest building, clearly operating on a limited budget, but maintained with care. Inside, elderly residents played chess alongside children working on their homework. A wall of photographs displayed decades of community events. And there, among them, Jonathan saw her again, his mother, smiling beside Sarah Hayes. "Mr. Pierce." A surprised voice pulled him from his thoughts. A woman in her 60s approached, recognition in her eyes. "I'm Martha Wilson, the director," she introduced herself. "This is unexpected." Jonathan turned back to the wall of photographs, gesturing toward them. "I'm trying to understand something," he said. "My mother, she volunteered here?" Martha nodded, a fond expression crossing her face. "For over 15 years, she said. "Eleanor was our guardian angel, though she never wanted recognition for it. When your father passed and she inherited his fortune, she poured so much into this place. She taught piano, helped with literacy programs, funded scholarships." Martha paused, studying him carefully. "She always hoped you'd visit one day." A tightness formed in Jonathan's chest. "And Sarah Hayes?" he asked. "She worked here too?" Martha's face softened with quiet sadness. "Sarah was one of our success stories," she said. "She came through our youth program as a teenager, She earned a scholarship to nursing school through your mother's foundation," Martha continued. "After that, She came back here to volunteer, giving back the way your mother had taught her. She hesitated, her expression dimming. When she got sick, Martha shook her head. Your mother was devastated. She helped cover Sarah's medical expenses until her own health started failing. The pieces were beginning to align, forming a picture Jonathan had never imagined. And Sarah's daughter? He asked. Lena? Martha's face softened. Sweet child. She still comes to our after-school program when her father is working. She has her mother's artistic talent and her kindness. Jonathan hesitated before asking the question that had been weighing on him since yesterday. Did she know my mother? Martha frowned slightly, thinking, No, I don't believe so. Eleanor passed before Lena was born. Why do you ask? Jonathan felt both relief and deeper confusion. If Lena had never met his mother, how could she possibly know the things she did? One more question, he said. The willow tree. Was there one here? Martha smiled knowingly. Follow me. She led him through the center, into a quiet courtyard. There, spreading its elegant branches over a small garden, stood a mature willow tree. Your mother donated this tree 20 years ago, Martha explained. She called it her thinking spot. She'd sit here for hours, especially after board meetings at your company, when certain decisions troubled her. Beneath the tree stood a simple stone bench. Jonathan stepped closer, his pulse quickening. Something was carved into the seat. Remember your promise. His hands began to tremble. All this time, he had assumed his mother's deathbed words referred to a private childhood moment. But what if they had meant something else? Something bigger? Mr. Pierce, are you all right? Martha's voice was gentle, laced with concern. Jonathan barely heard her. His thoughts were spinning. The Eleanor Pierce Children's Fund, he murmured, more to himself than to her. What happened to it after my mother died? Martha's expression darkened. It was slowly dismantled, she admitted. Programs were cut, scholarships reduced. Then, finally, it was absorbed into your corporate foundation. She hesitated before adding, Many children lost opportunities because of it. Then she stopped herself. I'm sorry. That's not my place to say. But Jonathan knew it was exactly her place to say. In his relentless pursuit of expanding Pierce Global, he had allowed his board to quietly dismantle his mother's most personal legacy, not out of malice, out of indifference. As he thanked Martha and turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A message from Daniel Hayes. Hospital. St. Mary's. Lena collapsed at school. Jonathan's world shifted again. Without hesitation, he directed his driver to the hospital. Daniel Hayes paced anxiously in the sterile waiting room, his hands running through his already disheveled hair. What happened? Jonathan demanded the moment he arrived. They don't know, Daniel said, his face haggard with worry. She's been having headaches. I thought it was just stress. After her mother, I couldn't afford all the follow-up appointments they recommended. Before Jonathan could respond, a doctor approached, clipboard in hand. Mr. Hayes, we'd like to run some additional tests, an MRI specifically. Given your insurance situation, I want to discuss the cost before. Do whatever she needs, Jonathan interrupted, his voice firm. I'll cover all expenses. The doctor hesitated, glancing between the two men, clearly unsure of their relationship, but relieved by the financial clearance. We'll proceed immediately, she said. As they settled in to wait, Daniel's exhaustion finally cracked his guarded exterior. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. We're nothing to you. Jonathan looked at him, this overworked, grieving father, desperately trying to hold his world together for his daughter. The answer came with surprising clarity. Because I think my mother sent me to you, he said simply, and I've ignored her guidance for far too long. Hours later, as they sat beside Lena's hospital bed, waiting for her to wake from sedation, the doctor returned. There's something you need to see, she said, placing several films on the light board. She pointed to highlighted areas on Lena's brain scan. These markers here. I've only seen this pattern once before in my career. Her expression was grave, but behind it, a glimmer of hope. Lena's condition is remarkably similar to a case study published 10 years ago, she continued. An experimental treatment protocol was developed for Eleanor Pierce. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. "That's impossible," he whispered, staring at the scans, the illuminated patterns eerily familiar. "What exactly are you saying, Doctor?" Dr. Catherine Bennett turned to them, her voice steady but urgent. "This particular pattern of abnormalities is extremely rare. I've only ever seen it documented in one case study, your mother's. It's a unique form of cerebral microbleeds that often remain undetected until symptoms suddenly accelerate." Daniel gripped the edge of Lena's hospital bed, his knuckles white. "Is she going to die?" he asked, his voice raw, piercing the clinical stillness of the room. Dr. Bennett's gaze softened, but her determination remained firm. "Not if I can help it," she said. The protocol developed for Mrs. Pierce was groundbreaking, but at the time, it was still in its experimental stages. Since then, there have been significant advancements. With immediate intervention, Lena's prognosis could be much better. Jonathan felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. Jonathan felt as if he were standing in two worlds at once. One where he was a powerful CEO, able to command the finest medical care with a single phone call, and another where he was just a man, watching the possibility of history repeating itself, the same tragedy that had shaped his entire life now unfolding before him. "Whatever she needs," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "The best specialists. Experimental treatments. Anything." Dr. Bennett nodded. "I'll make the calls. We need to transfer her to New York Presbyterian. They have the specialized equipment, and the neurosurgeon who co-authored the original protocol with Dr. Rosenberg." As the doctor left to arrange the transfer, Daniel sank into a chair, his hands running over his face in exhaustion. "I don't understand any of this," he muttered. "How could Lena have the same condition as your mother? And how would she know things about Eleanor if they never even met?" Jonathan had been asking himself the same questions. The rational part of his mind searched for logical explanations. Perhaps Sarah had told Lena stories about Eleanor. Maybe there were letters or photographs he hadn't yet discovered. But none of those explanations accounted for the locket or the specificity of Lena's knowledge. "I don't have answers," Jonathan admitted, "but I've spent my entire life believing that everything can be explained through logic, through calculated risk." He exhaled. Maybe some things simply defy explanation. Lena stirred in the hospital bed, her small hand reaching out. Jonathan took it without hesitation. "The angels are loud today," she murmured, her eyes fluttering open. Despite the seriousness of the moment, she gave a weak smile. "Your mom is here," she whispered. "She says not to worry." Daniel made a choked sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Lena, honey, you need to rest," he said softly. "It's okay, Dad." Her voice was drowsy but steady. "Mr. Pierce's mom is going to help me get better." Then her gaze shifted to Jonathan, her expression more serious. "But you have to keep your promise first." Jonathan's throat tightened. "Which promise, Lena?" he asked gently. "The one about making the world better, not just richer." Her eyes drifted closed again, the medication pulling her back into sleep. For the next 72 hours, Jonathan barely left the hospital. When Lena was transferred to New York Presbyterian, he secured a private wing and assembled a team of specialists, led by Dr. Rosenberg himself, pulled from retirement for this case. Jonathan worked remotely when necessary, ignoring the increasingly urgent messages from his board of directors. And on the third day, Victoria Langley arrived in person, a stack of documents balanced in her arms. "The board is calling an emergency meeting," she informed Jonathan, watching as he flipped to the papers without truly seeing them. "Jonathan, they're talking about a vote of no confidence," she continued, her voice edged with urgency. "You've disappeared at a critical juncture in the Nakamura negotiations." Jonathan looked up, suddenly present. "Do you know what my mother's foundation actually did, Victoria?" he asked. She hesitated. "It primarily funded children's causes, community outreach, health initiatives for underserved populations, standard philanthropic work. I've already started the reinstatement process like you asked," she added carefully. "But it'll take time." "Time is something we don't have," Jonathan replied, setting the unsigned documents aside. The foundation was funding research into rare cerebrovascular disorders, the kind my mother had. If the research had progressed faster, it might have saved her, and now it might save Lena. Victoria's expression softened. "Is that what this is about?" she asked. "This little girl, she reminds you of your mother?" Jonathan exhaled. "It's more complicated than that." He crossed the room, staring out the window as he gathered his thoughts. "The fund was developing a treatment protocol when my mother died," he said quietly. "After her death, I let the board redirect those research grants to more profitable ventures. I told myself it was just business." "It was business," Victoria insisted. "Emotional investment doesn't belong in corporate strategy." Jonathan turned to face her. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "That's where I've been wrong. My mother built this company on relationships and trust. I've been running it on spreadsheets and acquisitions." He took a deep breath. "I'm restructuring the company," he said. "The Eleanor Pierce Children's Fund will be reinstated with a permanent endowment of $5 billion. Victoria's eyes widened. "And I'm stepping down as CEO." She stared at him. "You can't be serious." Jonathan smiled faintly. "I've never been more serious. I'm not abandoning the company. I'll remain as chairman. But I need someone who understands the day-to-day operations to take over as CEO." He held her gaze. "Someone like you." Victoria shook her head. "Jonathan, you're not thinking clearly." "Actually," he said, nodding toward Lena's hospital room, where Daniel sat reading softly to his sleeping daughter, "for the first time in years, I am." That man lost his wife to cancer, works 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, and still finds time to read to his daughter every night. He has more integrity in his tired bones than most of the people I deal with in. Later that evening, Dr. Rosenberg emerged from a consultation, his expression calm but edged with optimism. "The procedure is scheduled for tomorrow morning," he informed them. "Based on a refined protocol, I'm optimistic about Lena's recovery. She's young, and we've caught it much earlier than we did with your mother." Jonathan exhaled, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. "Thank you, doctor, for everything." After Rosenberg left, Jonathan found himself outside in the hospital's small garden courtyard. He wasn't alone. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, staring up at the slivers of night sky visible between the city buildings. The 2 men had barely spoken beyond medical discussions, yet quiet understanding had settled between them. "The doctor from your mother's case," Daniel said, breaking the silence. "He remembers Sarah." Jonathan turned to him. "She was a nurse on the oncology floor when your mother was receiving treatment." Daniel continued. "Apparently, they talk a lot about their kids." He glanced back up at the sky. "Maybe that's how Lena knows things. Maybe Sarah told her stories." "Maybe," Jonathan said, though they both knew that didn't explain everything. After a long pause, Daniel finally asked a question that had lingered between them for days. "Why are you doing all this?" Jonathan considered his answer carefully. "When I was building my company," he admitted, "I forgot why wealth matters." He exhaled, his voice steady but reflective. "My mother never did. She understood that money only has real value when it serves a purpose greater than itself." Jonathan met Daniel's gaze. "I'm not trying to save Lena because I feel guilty or because I need to solve some cosmic mystery. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, because my mother would have done the same." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "Sarah always said there were angels watching over us," he murmured. "I never really believed her." "Neither did I," Jonathan admitted. "But I'm starting to think maybe we were both wrong." The surgery lasted 11 hours. When Dr. Rosenberg finally emerged, exhaustion was etched into his face, but his eyes were bright. "She's going to be fine," he announced. "The procedure was successful. There may be some therapy needed during recovery, but I expect a full return to normal life." The months that followed transformed Jonathan's life in ways he never could have imagined. The Eleanor Pierce Children's Fund became one of the largest private medical research foundations in the country. St. Clair's Community Center was rebuilt and expanded, and Jonathan found himself spending less time in board meetings and more time mentoring children and overseeing scholarships, carrying on the work his mother had devoted her life to. But the most unexpected change came during those long hospital visits. Through conversations with Emma Bennett, the dedicated neurologist who had first recognized Lena's condition and connected it to Eleanor's case. What began as professional consultations gradually turned into coffee breaks, then dinners, then something deeper. 1 year after finding Lena at his mother's grave, Jonathan stood beneath the willow tree at St. Clair's, now the centerpiece of Healing Garden, funded by his foundation. Emma's hand was warm in his, her presence a steadying force in his transformed life. "You look happy," she observed, studying his face with the same quiet attentiveness she gave her patients. "Different from the man I met in that hospital room." Jonathan smiled. "I am different," he admitted. "Better, I hope." Across the garden, Lena chased butterflies, her laughter light and carefree, carried by the spring breeze. Her recovery was complete. Nearby, Daniel sat on a bench dedicated to Sarah, watching his daughter with peaceful contentment. The weight of financial worry had been lifted from his shoulders. He now managed community outreach programs at the foundation, work he not only excelled at, but took pride in. "Do you ever wonder," Emma asked quietly, "if it was all just coincidence?" Lena finding the locket, knowing those stories, having the exact same condition as your mother. Jonathan glanced at the silver locket, now returned to Lena as a keepsake. "I used to need explanations for everything," he said. "But now, I'm content with some mysteries remaining unsolved." He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around a small velvet box. The timing felt right. Here, in this place where so many threads of fate had woven together. As he turned to Emma, prepared to ask the question that would begin the next chapter of his life, a sudden breeze stirred the willow branches above them. For just a moment, Jonathan could have sworn he heard his mother's gentle laughter on the wind. And when Lena glanced up from her butterfly chase, flashing him an encouraging smile and a knowing wink, he couldn't help but smile back at the unlikely messenger who had brought him home.